Hello, my name is Andrew Stewart, and I am the author of Taxi Searchers, John Wayne, Robert De Niro, and the Meaning of America. This book uses two films, The Searchers and Taxi Driver, as entryways for starting conversations about race and racism with friends and loved ones. It is my hope that by serializing this book online that it becomes possible to relieve some of the pressures that have been generated by the election of Donald Trump and the advent of the so-called alt-right. What follows is a short film trailer for the book that explains my thesis and offers preliminary insight. I hope that you will return often to read the newest entries in the series and perhaps consider buying a copy via Amazon.com.
What makes a man to wander? What makes a man to roam? What makes a man leave bed and board and turn his back on home? Right right away, right
It's not really an extra credit answer to mention that filmmakers like Scorsese, Coppola, Spielberg, and Lucas were influenced by John Ford's classic western, The Searchers. For example, the scene in Star Wars that Luke Skywalker discovers his aunt and uncle have been killed is exactly akin to when Ethan Edwards discovers the burning farm belonging to his brother Eric. This is quite well known, but I wanted to start trying to look deeper, not just into Taxi Driver, but The Searchers, because there's something in both films that's very important for us to understand nowadays. One only needs to think back to John Hinckley Jr., for example, who took a great deal of warped inspiration for the film and for some reason decided he needed to assassinate Ronald Reagan. But I also believe that this film, The Searchers, also provides an insight into a certain kind of madness that we still are grappling with as Americans. The Searchers was released in 1956, and Taxi Driver was released 20 years later in 1976. What's interesting in that 20-year span is the great social, economic, and even spiritual upheaval that America went through. The first film, The Searchers, was released in the midst of the Brown versus Board of Education disputes regarding integration in schools and the civil rights movement. The second film, Taxi Driver, by contrast, was released when that era was slowly but surely winding down thanks to the presidency of Nixon. The other interesting point that unites both films is the fact that they were produced at the tail ends of the Vietnam War.
I think the American people this fall, when they elect a Congress, all of the congressmen, 1/3 of the Senate, regardless of whether they're going to vote Democrat or Republican, should ask those senators and congressmen, say to them, Mister, if we send you to Washington, Are you going to continue sending American money to nations which in turn ship the sinews of economic and military strength to Red China, which is running the war in Indochina, keeping in mind that if we lose Indochina, Mr. Jenkins, we will lose the Pacific.
Ford released his film just 5 years after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, when Eisenhower and Kennedy both were heavily promoting the cause of defeating communism in Vietnam. Scorsese's 1976 film was released just 10 months after the end of American involvement in Vietnam. What's common in both those instances is Travis Bickle and Ethan Edwards are on the side of a losing battle. Edwards fought for the Confederacy while Bickle fought for the American and South Vietnamese mission against the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh. These two men are haunted because they fought on the side of imperialism. In many ways, the Battle of Vietnam was a restaging of the battle between the Native Americans and the cavalry and cowboys. Also, while John Ford is certainly less sexually explicit than Paul Schrader's script, it is worthwhile to remember that both Ford and Scorsese are dealing with difficult topics surrounding sex, sexuality, femininity, and gender.
Aside, Martin.
Ethan and Travis are both obsessed with the concept of purity. In fact, both men are willing to kill to ensure the purity of the women of their desires. Things get really creepy when you realize the two are constantly talking about the connections between racism, sexism, and how that affects their own thinking about whether it's okay to kill people. Also, let's talk about scalping. For a lot of obvious reasons, John Ford cannot show castration on theater screens. But the act of scalping itself is symbolic of castration and the mutilation of your foe, so to delegitimize your opponent's masculinity.
You talking to me?
In this sense, the violence they execute against their enemies is an externalization of a sort of sexual violence, and the gun itself is a sort of representation of a phallic symbol in the act of physical rape. Both Travis and Ethan do not exist in worlds without having a heroine that they need to rescue. At the end of The Searchers, Ethan wanders off to go searching way out there because, in fact, he is unable to exist without having an idealized damsel in distress to rescue. Same with Travis Bickle, who ends the film in a sequence that emphasizes how truly insane he is, and therefore also may be adding insight to the true character of Ethan Edwards at the end of The Searchers. Now, a lot of people are probably going to start wondering, well, what's this actually got to do with us? But there's a lot of points. Ethan and Travis are both reacting to changing cultural norms regarding sexual license. Ethan is, of course, horrified at the concept that his niece has been married to Chief Scar and therefore has begun to live as a Native American, while Travis himself seems to be ill-adjusted to the feminist revolution and the changes in society that are beginning to take place around him. As a result, his discussions with Sybil Shepherd and other female characters are stilted and somewhat stiffened by his own inability to work around newly defined gender norms. And that seems to be a shared trait with many, many violent mass shooters and criminals who are genuinely psychotic and do not belong in the possession of a gun. What's also really interesting for me, especially in the last few years, has been noticing the sort of interconnections between The Searchers, Taxi Driver, and criticism of the Obama administration.